Ladies and gentlemen, it's a Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and today we have distinguished guest Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Please welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here as always.
Jonathan, so in 2021, Russia had second army in the world. By 2023, it had the second army in Ukraine.
Second best army in Ukraine, yeah.
Second best, and now it's second best army in Russia. It appears to me. So the evolution continues.
They're just going down. They're just going down the rankings.
And you know what's happened really? What's happening is that Ukrainian war made a complete reassessment of a use of nuclear weapons. It appears to me that it's coming to the point if Ukraine, non-nuclear country, invaded Russia-owned territory for the last 1,100 years, it cannot expel them because they first of all they have elite fighters there, and it's 10,000 elite fighters with all possible and impossible weapons and ammunition and support from artillery and missiles and ATACMS are there, F-16s are close by. It's a situation absolutely unbearable for Russia because even Russia would now stop all their actions in Ukrainian territory and would bring all their forces back to Russia. It would take them probably 6 months at the best to expel this well-fortified and very capable and well-armed Ukrainian forces. So what do you think, Jonathan, about the myth of the advantage of the side which has a nuclear forces?
Well, given the fact that the Russians themselves no longer have it shows that they do not have confidence even in their own nuclear forces to be able to expel the Ukrainians, assuming that their nuclear forces work as designed. And given the fact that we do know that the Russians do not invest that much in the way of resources to maintain their own nuclear forces. They're sort of doing that on the cheap. They're relying on the fact of their existence of their nuclear forces to exert the appropriate intimidation effect upon the West and upon Ukraine. However, now that the Ukrainians have in effect called the Russian bluff, they have counter-invaded. They have counter-invaded with a well-equipped and well-trained force and in many respects technologically superior to the area of Russia that they have invaded. And it has completely thrown the Russians off balance and caused them to declare a crisis. Now all of a sudden it's rather amusing to watch the Russians claiming that they're the victims now. They unleashed this war, then all of a sudden their opponents managed to turn the tables on them, and now they are complaining that they are the so-called victims. So this is even though it is a very tempting moment for Ukrainians and their allies, including the United States, to in fact gloat at the Russians' predicament, we still have to be cautious. We still have to exert them. We have to recognize when the Ukrainian offensive has reached its culminating point, when they have attained maximum advantage and they are not in danger, and the Ukrainian military has to be sure that they are not overextending themselves or rendering themselves vulnerable to a possible Russian counterattack. Even the Germans, when the Germans successfully exploited in May of 1940, when they successfully invaded France, and it exceeded their expectations, from their own perspective. The success of the offensive into France exceeded their own expectations, and the German military commanders were still wary. Even though as they were exploiting their advantage, they were still wary of a possible Allied counterattack, which did in fact occur at Arras. There was a British counterattack which momentarily panicked the German commanders. because they saw the counterattack coming, and but fortunately, the Allied armored doctrine, counterattack doctrine, was not yet sophisticated enough to be able to stop a German blitzkrieg. The Allies would not really get the hang, shall we say, get the hang of knowing how to stop a German blitzkrieg until about 1942 in the Soviet Union and as well as in North Africa, where a month under British forces under Montgomery. Well, they figured it out. They just simply anchored their line at El Alamein between the Mediterranean on one side and the Qattara Depression on the other, created a nice impenetrable line, which the Germans, once they were overextended, could not penetrate. So there are ways to stop a blitzkrieg, and there are moments where you have to recognize when you have reached your culminating point and you need to pull back. So that is the only cautionary advice, because there's much to be optimistic about in the success of the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk. But there is still cautionary note has to be sounded. You have to recognize, and I'm very confident that the Ukrainians themselves are smart enough and wary enough, self-aware enough to recognize when they have extracted the maximum advantage from their Kursk offensive, and will be able to consolidate and prepare for any potential Russian counterattack. I also would contend that the success of this offensive may well set the stage for a subsequent offensive, which seals off the Crimea, as you and I have been discussing for the past several months. I personally was anticipating that the offensive counterstroke would come in Crimea, and doggone it, the Ukrainians managed to surprise me. So I'm saying, well, bravo for the Ukrainians. They surprised everyone. And they kept their own counsel about what their intentions were, which is another reason why it succeeded.
Jonathan, it's kind of a new joke in the last day or two, is that Putin, in desperation, he summoned all his scientists and asked to sort of revive Stalin even for a few minutes so Putin could talk to him. And they did it. So Putin says, Yosef Vissarionovich, I'm in despair. You had that situation in Kursk 80 years ago. So how did you win that? What would you suggest me to do? And Stalin says, you idiot. You take American weapons and Ukrainian soldiers. That's how you win in Kursk.
Yeah, the Russians back then in the Kursk offensive, they recall the Russians apparently had were anticipating a German offensive at Kursk, Operation Citadel, and they prepared triple defensive lines around that salient, so that the German offensive would have to penetrate 3 defensive lines in order to achieve a breakthrough. And by that time, of course, they were receiving American trucks. They were getting Ford trucks, which would provide them with the logistical capability to sustain an offensive in a much better fashion than they otherwise would have been able to do.
Because the artillery could move at much higher speeds, because before the American trucks, they were horses. They were
horse-drawn wagons. And had the Russians been confined merely to horse-drawn wagons for their logistical support capability, their counteroffensive against German forces would have been much slower. They would have been a much slower duration. The Germans would actually have been able to hold out for much longer in the east had it not been for the United States supplying the Soviet Union with sufficient trucks to be able to enable their offensive capability to be maintained for a longer period.
Exactly. Now you mentioned that Russians during the Second World War, they had incredible fortifications that would not allow Germans to go for counterattacks. By the way, Russians learned from that, and they're now building for fortifications, but about 50 kilometers from their border, because it's now too late to build fortifications on the borders, because there's no longer border between Ukraine and Russia, at least around Kursk. So they're now moving 50 kilometers away from the border. But even that, we'll see how it will help. Russians, and because they will have to. Russians always like to have a buffer zone. So after the first line fortifications, there will be a buffer zone, and then second line of fortifications, and then another buffer zone, and so on. That's
This is going if the Ukrainians are able to exploit this properly
yeah.
and for a sufficient length of time, again, so that they are not overextended, but are able to consolidate and prepare a defense against any Russian counterattack. This will force the Russians to reorient their deployments, and it may force them to pull back uh, along those areas of Ukraine that they have invaded, so that they don't want to be cut off by any subsequent Ukrainian exploitation of their success in Kursk. So they have exposed a very big weak point in the Russian defenses, and the Ukrainians should exploit it for as long as they are able.
Exactly. And Jonathan, in your vision, what is the point? How would you describe the point at which Ukrainians have to agree and recognize that they've reached their objectives and they have to retreat or regroup or something else? What do you say?
Well, what they would be relying on is they would be relying on their Western allies and their intelligence resources. They have to be relying on satellites as well as other information gathering means to be able to recognize when the Russians are, in fact, gathering forces and being able to redeploy. They'll be able to do this because what the Ukrainians have now are what the Allies did not have during World War II: space assets. The existence of robust space assets in support of the Ukrainian effort will enable them to anticipate any Russian movement and be able to see what forces are being gathered against them. So if they
But,
can anticipate, yeah, go ahead.
but tell me, Moscow also has space assets and quite
Not
developed.
as sophisticated, not as if they have space assets, but not nearly as extensive as those of the West. They
Because
have them.
otherwise, how they can allow that situation develop? Because you're talking about 10,000 strong army to invading proper Russia. It's not Zaporizhia or even Crimea. It's a proper Russia for the last thousand plus years, and they penetrated it with easy. Get ahead 1,000 square kilometers. This is unheard of. This is I could never imagine that.
And the Ukrainians should exploit in terms of their propaganda, whatever other means they can use to maximize this propaganda and its value in the minds of the Russian people. In the minds of the Russian people, the war is now being taken to them. And we also note that the Ukrainians have deliberately contrasted their behavior in invading the Russians
Excellent.
with contrasting their behavior with that of the Russian invaders, whereas the Russian invaders were guilty of all sorts of war crimes that we can document. The Ukrainians have been very civilized and very humane in their treatment of Russian prisoners of war, as well as the Russian civilian population. They have been almost bent over backwards to be humane and civilized. Almost about as comparable an effort. For example, during World War II, the Americans, when they advanced into Germany, the Germans, when they were choosing to whom to surrender, the Germans would prefer to surrender to the Americans,
Of course.
and the British and the French, who are close second and third, definitely surrender to the Allies. Surrender to the Americans if you can, because you'll be fed as well as well treated. But nobody wanted to surrender to the Russians because they knew how they would be treated.
Well, ask 1.5 million German women who were all raped by
Yeah, they were. Yeah, some estimates say that was as high as 2 million.
even
2 million. But yeah, that's the
astonishing number. But
yes, it's astonishing. But the Russians have shown that they have not changed since World War II. Their attitudes and the way that they treat, and that has served. Those stories should have and probably have been spread to all of the NATO nations of Europe, And they said, this will be our fate if we do not support Ukraine, which is why there is such strong support for Ukraine among the various NATO allies. And somewhat more reluctant, although increasingly less reluctant on the part of the U.S. to support Ukraine. And so that is why the Ukrainians have decided to take their destiny into their own hands. They were not about to rely on the good graces or courage of any of their allies, however well-meaning they might be on the surface. They say, okay, we're going to change the game for you, and we are going to establish the favorable conditions on which to end this war. And so the Ukrainians have in effect rolled the iron dice. The iron dice have come up favorably for the Ukrainians, and now they are exploiting that advantage to the maximum extent possible. And from my perspective, I would applaud them for doing that. Senator Lindsey Graham has been very praiseworthy in his comments about the Ukrainian offensive, calling it bold and courageous, and he's very sincere about that. And but he's glad that they are taking the initiative to secure their own freedom and security. And so this is a very interesting moment. As I said, though, from my personal perspective, observing all of this, I would not be surprised in the least if the Ukrainians had a follow-up punch designed to seal off
You can only guess so where it's going to happen, but it will.
Where and when.
Yes.
Because now they have this closing window of time between now and, I would say, okay, a real window of time would be the November elections. Okay. Yeah. They want to be able to establish clearly the conditions for peace and have their destiny clearly held in their own hands before the November elections, and potentially that might cause disruption in the degree of support. We don't know this. We don't know what the intentions are of either political party in the United States. So, given all that, given those unknowns, no serious observer can blame the Ukrainians for taking the offensive.
Well, what's interesting is that Ukraine completely changed the psychological character of all this war, because if before they had appearance of victimhood, and now it's all gone. All of a sudden, it's a country which can do a lot of things on their own. In fact, they didn't consult their allies, including the United States, about this rate
because they realized that they might as well just tell if they told their allies, given the relatively poor degree of operational security that is being practiced in the West, yeah, they might as well have been just in telling the Russians in the clear what the Ukrainians were going to do.
Now, what's interesting is that Joe Biden was consulted right when the Ukrainian attack started, and he was informed every 3-4 hours about the further developments. So he knew right from the beginning of this incursion of what's really happening. I've learned that from very trusted sources and public sources, by the way. Well, there is a plausible deniability that he was not consulted about starting the operation, so he was only informed of what's happening. So he couldn't do really much about it when it's already underway. So that's another clever move.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, the Ukrainians are taking that philosophy I've mentioned before. It's better to beg forgiveness than to ask permission. Absolutely. They weren't asking his permission. They were telling him, we're doing this. See you later.
Yeah, like when I was in Soviet Army back almost 50 years ago, the law was shoot first, then ask the questions. Okay, because when you ask the questions, there could be ways.
The American equivalent is called reconnaissance by fire.
That's exactly the right thing to do. So right now, Russia is busy building their fortifications 50 kilometers from the border, and in the meantime, where else to build fortifications? See, the interesting thing is that, okay, during Second World War, there was a front line, and very solid front line that you couldn't easily penetrate one way or another, but there was a front line. Now, in this war in Ukraine, there is no such a front line because it's so fluid. It says, okay, the Dek village, 50 kilometers in Ukrainian territory. So its front line also moved to where the village is, or it still stay there, and only a week later it will be moved maybe 50 or even 100 kilometers ahead. So there's no such distinction on front lines between Russian control side and Ukrainian control side. It can change in hours. If you remember Bakhmut, they were changing the line of penetration either side. It's changing not daily, sometimes in 2 hours. It could go already different line, and then 4 hours later it could go either way. So that didn't exist during Second World War. So during Second World War, then what Ukrainians did probably would be impossible. For example,
Right.
for Germans to do something like that, because they had to penetrate the front line, and it would be impossible. Now, explanation is that although in Second World War there was a gigantic front line, it was probably 2,000, if not 3,000 kilometers.
It was it was several thousand kilometers long when
Yeah, like from
you're
the
going
north.
from Murmansk, from going extending to Stalingrad and the Caucasus in the south, all the
Absolutely.
way to Finland,
Oh, by the way,
because Finland was nominally for a while on the side of the Nazis.
yeah,
They had German troops in Finland, a limited contingent, and the Germans attempted at least to try through Norway because there is this little, very narrow span of. Had the Germans been able to successfully exploit through Norway and Finland, they could have threatened Murmansk, which was, as you know, the primary port for receiving Lend-Lease from the West into Russia.
absolutely. Yeah,
And they could have if the Germans had chosen to exploit their opportunity there, they could have shut off Lend-Lease from the West to Russia, and would have forced Lend-Lease to go all the way through Persia.
yeah,
It would force a much longer logistical link. But in any case, now the contrast is now the Ukrainians have been able to successfully integrate Western aid into their armed forces. They are, and through various means, even with their F-16s, they're asking for retired American pilots
yes.
to be willing to fly those F-16s until enough Ukrainians are trained to be able to have the necessary number of pilots trained to operate the increasing number of F-16s they're getting. And once those are integrated in, I anticipate, again, just from my perspective, I anticipate that the effect of those successfully integrated F-16s will be larger than expected, larger than anticipated. It will have a bigger effect. It will enable the Ukrainians to gain air superiority over what area of the front they choose to have the F-16s providing air cover. And that could, for example, since the F-16s are currently based outside of Ukraine, from what we've been told, they are not based within Ukraine, so basically prevent the Russians from getting an easy shot at them. Once those F-16s, they could very well be employed in mass against Crimea. To seal off, as part of a counteroffensive operation, to seal off Crimea from Russian control and reinforcements. Once that occurs, that's the 1-2 punch. They've thrown the first punch into Kursk to throw the Russians off balance, and then they can follow up with another punch against Crimea.
By the way, the first missiles are already working on the Crimean bridge. It's just started as we speak. So we'll see how.
So once they finish severing that Crimean bridge, then the logistics link will have been effectively cut, and then that provides, again, with those other forms of aid and reinforcement coming in, the Ukrainians can then have the luxury of choosing when to throw the second punch.
And the beauty for Russians, from Russian point of view, the beauty is they don't need to build fortifications in Crimea anymore. They don't need them.
They won't be, they'll be cut off. So why bother to reinforce? Why,
Absolutely.
why, why pour reinforcements into an area that's going to be cut off? That situation would be similar to what happened to the Germans. Remember, in North Africa, as soon as at one end in late 1942, the British Army stopped the German offensive at El Alamein and Alam el Hafa, stopped them on one end, and then at the same time, in November 1942, the Allies and the Americans invaded at the other end of the African continent, Operation Torch. So then you had the Allies who had cut the Germans off from two sides, but of course then the Germans made a huge mistake. Then they decided to pour all those reinforcements into Tunis and tried a counteroffensive against the Americans at Kasserine Pass. But they were doing all these things. They were pouring reinforcements into an area they could not hope to control. And as a result, the amount of troops that they lost eventually was over 300,000, 300,000 prisoners of war. And so they couldn't pull them out. So in any
That
case,
number equals Stalingrad, by the way.
yeah, that's about right. Yeah,
Yeah.
they took about almost as big a loss as they suffered at Stalingrad. So when you take all those losses together, that was enough to signal the beginning of the end for the Nazi Empire. But in this case, we have as Mark Twain once said, history doesn't repeat itself. It does rhyme, though.
Excellent.
So history is rhyming. So what we have here is the Ukrainians have seized the strategic initiative from the Russians through their Kursk offensive, and they have the opportunity in the coming months, I predict, again, my personal assessment, to throw a second punch, a follow-up punch, which would take, I predict it would take not only the Russians, but it would once again take the Western Allies by surprise. Say, what are you doing? You're winning.
And, just before we finish, I would like to mention about the history rhymes. Look at the leopards 80 years ago in Kursk, and now again, 80 years, and leopards are there again. And now there's 180,000 Russians are waiting to be evacuated from the Kursk region and Belgorod and others. This is a humanistic catastrophe. There is nothing short of it. Remember, 180,000 people, they will have to leave their homes. They have to relocate who knows where.
And the Russian propaganda machine will not be able to really disguise it. All they can do is portray themselves as victims, and that is going to have a severe ripple effect amongst the Russian population, amongst the morale of the Russian people, and their willingness to continue supporting this war. You will probably have a rise in the number of desertions in the Russian army, in an increasing difficulty in being able to mobilize Russian conscripts to support any offensive or even defensive actions, for that matter.
Absolutely.
So again, as in all of this, the Ukrainians have to be very not euphoric, not complacent, not overly optimistic, but continue to press their advantage and watch very carefully for signs that, okay, we have gotten as much out of this as we can from the Kursk offensive, but then the time comes, I say, then they have two decisions to make. Do we consolidate on defense in Kursk, and do we throw another punch? At that time, that would be a good time to throw another punch, and this time in a far removed area of the front against the Crimean Peninsula.
Yeah, Jonathan, they are capable to do both. They can really stay in that area.
They can go on defense in Kursk, and they can start another counteroffensive to throw the Russians off even more.
Absolutely.
And all of this becomes possible because finally the Ukrainians are receiving the aid that they desperately need in order to start the offensive. As cautious as the Western Allies have been, or reluctant at some point to provide the aid, because let's be fair, the Western Allies did not anticipate this situation. They did not anticipate that. Well, for one, they failed to anticipate the Russian offensive against Crimea, against Ukraine, which they should have, but they did not anticipate. They failed once again. They did not anticipate that the Ukrainians would be able to successfully resist the Russian invasion.
Jonathan, it all started in the first day of war when Americans offered Zelensky and his family to be moved to the West. And he said, I need weapons, not the taxi. Remember? That's what's happened on the first day. And what Ukrainians did in the last several days in Kursk, it's mind-boggling. And I think it will be studied in all armies around the world.
I can tell you one development that's going to take place in the West. Now, you may not know, but in the United States, there has been since about the late 1950s a growing commercial war game industry. In other words, where war games on virtually every battle in history are sold to military enthusiasts in the United States who are interested in war games. And I have a collection myself. But the thing is, various commercial war games, what they do is, particularly with more modern wars that have taken place, these commercial war game companies will study those conflicts, and then they will produce war games for sale to the public, anyone who wants to buy them, on these various military campaigns. And I can tell you almost with metaphysical certitude that there are several war game companies in the United States that are watching and studying this Russian-Ukrainian war, and they're basically going to be in a race once this war concludes, or even if it looks like it, even maybe before it completely concludes, that at least one or more of these war game companies will produce a war game for commercial sale to the public for those who want to study.
No doubts about that. Even today, if you put together a game like Putin caught pens down in Kursk, that game can be
game over.
Jonathan, I would like to thank you so much for today's program. I think we have even more exciting news by Tuesday, same place.
The trends are all going in the right direction.
Yes,
we can all keep ourselves what I call prayerfully optimistic.
Agree.
Trust in God for the outcome, but in the meantime, we observe and we are cautiously optimistic for continued success of the Ukrainian people in securing their own freedom and security.
Great. Have everybody a very happy weekend, and glory to Ukraine. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
You might need to wake up, Mark.
Okay, maybe he has sweet dreams.